To understand the Bishops' War in Scotland and the following House of Commons debates that led to the English Civil War, a political context has to be established, the width being international and the depth including rumors and conspiracy. The publisher William Preen's attempt to smear Archbishop Laud by identifying him as the head of a Catholic party at the English court was considered fanatical by later historians and even by some of Preen's contemporaries. However, the belief that the Church of England was close to popery and thus would foster Catholicism was a legitimate concern, a concern that transcended faith and extended to the nature of government and even economic systems. In short, religion at this time was truly the fulcrum of liberty or tyranny. Later historians to claim that the conspiracy was purely for propaganda by some Protestant politicians can be questioned. In the 1630s, as in the 1670s, the Catholics were a minority, most powerful at court and in London, and for the most part politically inert. None of this prevented the political crisis caused by the accession of James II, a Catholic ruler, in 1685. In short, the fears propagated by politicians in the 1630s and 40s was proven to be real just a half a century later. Though some of the rumors at the time are just plain false, it's necessary to dive into murky waters because many figures enjoyed access to royal court without official position. The Catholic conspiracy broadly outlined is thus: by sowing dissension between king and parliament, or between England and Scotland, the Catholics could divide the king's subjects and weaken royal authority. This would lay the foundation for a Pope-sponsored coup d'etat in which a foreign invasion would be supported by a native fifth column. The conspiracy grew in fertile ground because of the unwillingness of the king and his ministers to detach themselves from a pro-Spanish and pro-Catholic orientation. This alienated some important and even some moderate leaders, thus damaging the chances for compromise on the eve of the Long Parliament, where the leaders brought their accusations of Catholic plotting, chiefly against the Crown's leading ministers, toppled most of them, and heightened anxieties to the point of combustion. In March 1635, during the time of King Charles's personal rule, the Lord Treasurer Portland died, initiating a realignment of both domestic and foreign affairs. The following year, William Juxon, Bishop of London, was appointed, and he did not have the same control over policy, particularly foreign policy, as his predecessor. The increasing customs revenue in England was the result of English neutrality in the 30 Years' War. Supplemented by income derived from favors to Spain that were beyond neutrality, Catholic Spain, non-parliamentarian government, and ship money taxes caused grievances. I desire that we may look into the very belly and bowels of this Trojan horse to see if there be not men in it ready to open the gates to Romish tyranny and Spanish monarchy. For an Arminian is the spawn of a papist, spoke parliamentarian Frances Rous. Charles aspired to equality with the most respected courts of the Western world, France, Spain, and the Empire, all of which were Catholic. Both Catholic and Protestant frequently supposed that the king's tolerance for Catholicism meant that he was personally sympathetic to it and possibly susceptible to conversion. King James I himself was fond of saying, as his son Charles did, that he was a Catholic but not a Roman Catholic. Charles's neutrality in foreign policy proved to be domestically dangerous. The failure to act in the 30 Years' War sparked widespread skepticism about the king's commitment to Protestantism and caused suspicion about the persuasion of court Catholics on English foreign policy. Countries involved in the 30 Years' War, France, Sweden, and Spain, were active in recruiting mercenaries from the British Isles, which gave foreign agents reason to cultivate friends at court, even when they could not meld an official alliance with England. For a lucrative price, Charles allowed Spanish ships to unload silver at Plymouth and take it overland to London, where it was shipped to Spanish Flanders. Thus, the German Hapsburgs, Spain, and the government at Brussels were increasingly interdependent. Bernard of Weimara's capture of the Rhine fortress of Breisach in 1638, along with the French occupying Savoy, Alsace, and Lorraine, caused the Spanish land route, called the Spanish Road, to be cut off. To supply Germany and Flanders, the Habsburgs had to depend on a sea route that was controlled by England. However, Charles's sister, Elizabeth of Bohemia, was a major figurehead for the Protestant cause in Germany, and many English people felt England must join the battle against the Roman Antichrist. Charles's unwillingness to aid his sister and the German Protestants, but instead to sell favors to Spain, tarnished his image as a godly prince. The military ineffectiveness of Charles's nephew, the Protestant Prince Palatine Charles Louis, who inherited the loyalties of his mother, was seen by the English people as a result of a subversive influence in the royal court. The pro-French element in the English court was Protestant and anti-Spanish. They were not as zealous for high position and responsibility and did not have an ideological stance. Their antipathy toward the king at the end of the 1630s was significant. This group was mostly a Percy family connection. Algernon Percy, Earl of Northumberland. The members of the pro-French party who were privy councillors in 1642, Holland, Leicester, Northumberland, and Pembroke, would all join the parliamentarians in the Civil War. The other faction in the royal court were ideologically and religiously varied, but were united in their support of a pro-Spanish neutrality. Thomas Viscount Wentworth, the future Earl of Strafford, stood alone because his pro-Spanish orientation was not accompanied by a firm opposition to calling Parliament. A parliamentary leader in the 1620s, Stafford believed as late as 1640 that an English Parliament could be successfully managed for the king. The rest of the faction for pro-Spanish neutrality were resolutely set against calling a parliament. Sir Francis Winbank was suspected as being a crypto-Catholic. He was used by the king for secret negotiations with Spain, which bypassed senior colleagues and the rest of the Privy Council. Winbank kept up correspondence with Catholic agents in Rome, introduced negotiations between papal agents and the king, and it was to him that the royal family turned to execute acts of clemency to Catholics and Catholic priests. Thomas, Earl of Arendelle, descendant of two distinctly Catholic lines, had conformed to the Church of England in 1616, but was widely seen as a crypto-Catholic and discussed by foreign ambassadors as potential head of a Catholic party. Following Buckingham's death in 1628, the Villiers family had much less influence on policy. From the early 1620s, the family had shown a preference for Catholicism, which provided fuel for parliamentary charges of maintaining popery that were brought against the Duke at the end of the decade. The Duke's widow, Catherine, Duchess of Buckingham, had been raised Catholic. Within a year of the Duke's assassination, she publicly recanted Protestantism and cleared her household of Protestant servants. In 1635, she married the Irish Catholic Randall MacDonald, Earl of Antrim. The third faction, a small group mostly without official positions, were native and foreign Catholics who strongly supported an alliance with Spain. The importance of this group increased between 1636 and 1642. Wat Montague, Sir Toby Matthew, both converts to Catholicism, priest George Gage, his brother Colonel Sir Henry Gage, Endymion Porter, whose conversion to Catholicism was prevented only by his fear of losing office, the group of eminent anti-Richelieu exiles whom the Duchess of Chevreuse was the most active, and the Spanish imperial and papal agents. This group promoted an alliance with Spain as an alternative source of income to calling Parliament and objected to a Parliament because they feared it would adopt anti-Catholic measures. After Lord Treasurer Portland's death, the realignment swung away from a pro-Spanish orientation to a near alliance with France. At the beginning of 1638, the element in court shifted back to neutrality that was pro-Spanish in effect. Finally, the Spanish party gained prominence among the royal family during the Bishops' War and integrated with a specifically Catholic party, which was shaped and directed by the papal agents. The effect of this evolution proved devastating. Catholics and foreigners were perceived to be influencing both the domestic and the foreign policy of the court, shaping the king's response to the Scottish crisis, conspiring against the Parliament, and damaging the interests of the Prince Palatine. By the middle of 1640, the Percy connection had lost faith in the king. A report by Father Leonard of Paris, a French Capuchin, on the good disposition of Archbishop William Laud toward Catholicism and on Laud's influence with the king caused a misconception from Rome that resulted in an unauthorized offer of a cardinal's cap to be made in 1633 to Laud as an inducement to his conversion. A few months later, in early 1634, Christopher Davenport, usually known to contemporaries under his Franciscan name, Franciscus a Sancta Clara, a chaplain of the Queen and friend of Winbank, published Deus Natura Gratia, a book that became the talk of London. Dedicated to Charles, who was much pleased with it, the work embodied a commentary on the 39 Articles and a treatise on justification. The aim was to demonstrate that at almost every point Anglican beliefs could be reconciled with Catholic doctrine. Benedictine Leander Jones, a convert who had been Laud's friend at St. John's College, Oxford, visited England in 1634 and 1635. A rumor circulated that Laud had invited Jones, intending to discuss with him theology and possible Anglo-Roman reconciliation. Leander's reports to Rome on the English Church, which seem to have circulated in England as well, encouraged the impression that he was involved in negotiations that went far beyond the Benedictine missionary organization with which he was empowered to deal. Leander downplayed the differences between the Church of England and the Roman Church, sketched that the English bishops as ripe for conversion, and the king as willing to cooperate in this, and suggested that chances were very good for a religious coup d'etat, whereby Catholicism would again become the state religion. Helpless to end the negotiations with Rome, of which he disapproved, Archbishop Laud had to suffer rumors that he had initiated them. Though Laud endured the Protestant spectrum of skeptical to fanatical, the certain danger to Puritanism was about to be manifested at King Charles's court. George Conn served as papal agent at the court of Henrietta Maria from 1636 to 1639. Conn was Scottish, born in Turriff, and his presence at court when the new prayer book was introduced looked nothing short of a sinister design to the most anxious souls in Scotland. After arriving at the English court, George Conn had established himself as an eminent courtier with a burgeoning social circle and an intimacy with the royal family. In contrast to his predecessor, whose poor English restricted his contacts, Conn was respected, if not loved, by both Catholic and Protestant at court. Because Conn was in constant attendance on the Queen as one of her spiritual advisors, the king and the agent saw each other almost daily, informally and without appointment. Conn reported back to Rome that the king's beliefs were close to Catholic and that Charles was wholly disinclined to Calvinism. To the great distaste of the Puritan observers, Conn gleefully reported, King and the Pope representative held long discussion of religion and state matters. Conn's duty inclined him into a stance that English Protestants had come to regard as most threatening, an alliance with two forces, one secular and one religious, with Spain and with the Jesuits. He began to create at the English court a devout party that would protect Catholics, contrast the Puritans in loyalty to the king, extol the virtues of the Church as a protector of monarchy, and ultimately press for freedom of Catholic practice. The Venetian ambassador at the time expanded this view, noting the real aim of the Pope in this diplomatic exchange, he said, was the conversion of Charles, and there were signs that this could occur. Conn also offered much attention to the Palatine princes on their visit to England. Reviving a proposal that had been made earlier by Urban VIII, Con and Arendelle suggested that Charles Louis might go to live in Italy or at the imperial court, where presumably he would be gradually drawn into Catholicism. Rupert, more excited at the possibility of a trip to Rome, proved more susceptible to Con's suggestions. The projects of conversion ended for the time being with the prince's departure in June 1637. Their mother, Elizabeth of Bohemia, was appalled at the influence the court Catholics had on Rupert, exclaiming that had he stayed 4 more days in England, he would have been converted. Already in 1637, Laud was writing unhappily to Strafford, "I conceive it most true that the party of the Queen grows very strong, and I fear some consequences of it very much." Among the lay courtiers, Wat Montague was a prime influence and also the favorite of Queen Henrietta Maria. This son of the Earl of Manchester and brother of Lord Mandeville had been forced into exile by his conversion to Catholicism in 1635. At the Roman court in 1636, he had heartily advocated Con's appointment. With the Queen, the Duchess of Buckingham, and the Earl of Holland all helping, early in 1637, Con negotiated Montague's return to England. Once arriving, Montague drew into the court Catholic group his friend Sir Kenelm Digby, son of the gunpowder plotter Sir Everard Digby. In Paris, Digby published a pamphlet setting forth Charles's once supposedly pro-Catholic views, much to the king's displeasure. Another ambiguous association for Con was Sir Toby Matthew, son of the Protestant Archbishop of York. Not only was Matthew identified with the Jesuit point of view, he was rumored to be one of their number. He enjoyed good relations with many prominent courtiers, being a client of both the Howard and the Villiers family. Matthew was useful to Con, and for a time he acted as a go-between with Wentworth in Ireland. As time would show, the two men came to be associated in the public mind as symbols of court Catholicism. Con's personal charm, his connections with Rome, and his official standing made him a focus of new activity and intrigue. Day-to-day interventions on behalf of Catholics were taken to Secretary of State Winbank. Con recognized their partnership was for the routine defense of English Catholics, but his chief patrons were the Howards and Villiers. The Countess of Arendelle was, according to Con, Catholic in all but profession. At court, it was rumored that Con had reconciled the Countess to the Church of Rome. Con established equally friendly relations with the Duchess of Buckingham and her circle, and nudged her into a stricter religious observance. He ensured that she did not attend her own daughter's Protestant marriage to the Duke of Lenox. Until the Duchess moved to Ireland late in 1638 with her second husband, the Earl of Antrim, she occasionally carried messages between Con and Archbishop Laud, a relationship that was watched closely by the Puritans. William Juxon, Lord Treasurer and Bishop of London, and also Archbishop Laud's associate, gave a dinner party for Con that caused much talk in London. Con opened his chapel where the Barberini arms were displayed. Con encouraged the Queen to involve herself in ecclesiastical appointments and to work for the promotion of bishops she believed sympathetic to Rome. This exercise of patronage over English ecclesiastics was no secret at court and could only contribute to the impression that the Laudian Church was on the path to Rome. Firmly resolved against the readmission of any Catholic bishop to England, Laud was even more aghast at the possibility that Con would be created a cardinal. The break with Rome had left the English hierarchy intact, except for this highest dignity. Should it be conferred on Con, the archbishop would be ecclesiastically outranked at the English court. Con and Laud negotiated. The meaning, extent, and content of these negotiations remained cloaked in mystery. Even Laud's enemy, William Preen, was unable to provide firm evidence when he helped draw up the case for treason against Laud in 1643. But if Con's reports to Rome are to be believed, some contacts between the two were sustained. Despite Laud's political reluctance to agree to a meeting, Laud had passed from appeasement to sustained opposition, partly as a result of the developing crisis in Scotland and the accusations made against him by the Scots. When the Queen's secretary, Sir Robert Ayton, died in March 1638, there was speculation about his successor. Con's suggestions prevailed in selecting Sir John Winter, nephew of the Earl of Worcester and related to one of the gunpowder plotters. Winter was closely associated with the Jesuits. If the appointment of a Catholic was unpopular with the Protestants, the appointment of one with such a background was detested. Court Catholicism became associated with papal meddling, Spanish intrigue, and repressive domestic policies. Con's arrival in England coincided with a period of foreign enthusiasm. In 1636, it seemed that England might drop its neutrality in Europe and enter an alliance against the Hapsburgs. Up to this point, the Prince Palatine suffered one defeat after another as his uncle looked on. In an observation which was not completely mistaken, it was easy for Protestants to attribute the unpopular English foreign policy to Catholic influence. The French asserted that the Spanish party had captured the English government and would cajole the king away from honoring any treaty with France. The Scot John Dury, an ecumenicist, spent the 1630s trying to bring about unity among the Protestants of Northern Europe in preparation for an anti-Habsburg league. Dury's writings on church union warned against the subversive character of the Jesuits. He portrayed their crafty attempts to divide the Protestant world as secret agents directed by the Pope. Dury's efforts were supported by a number of future leaders of Parliament, including a selection of leading Puritans, such as Essex, Brooke, Mandeville, and Pyne. Throughout the 1630s, popular sentiment was that English Protestantism and continental Protestantism were mutually dependent. John Napier's work, The Plain Discovery of the Whole Revelation of St. John, had identified 1639 as the year when a new trumpet would sound to usher in the final warfare between good and evil. The failure of Charles I to fully support the interests of the Prince Palatine suggested the work of anti-Protestant agents at the court, particularly Spanish, Jesuit, and Habsburg intrigue. Broad suspicions were founded with the success of Con at the English court along with the influx of foreign friends of Spain. Both elements occurring at a time when Spain's interests sought closer cooperation from England and when Charles's financial hardship tempted him to ask favors from Spain. In 1638 and 1639, the arrival of distinguished French exiles, opponents of Richelieu and therefore intriguers with Spain, accentuated the pro-Spanish aspect at English courts. Marie de Medici was the most distinguished of these exiles. The Queen Mother constituted an adamant Catholic presence at court and in one instance brought a Palatine princess to Mass with her. The mother of three kings was served by her Jesuit confessor when she opened her own chapel in St. James Palace. Unsurprisingly, the Queen Mother made herself agreeable to George Con, particularly with ambitions that the Pope might be induced to support her readmission to France. In 1636 through 1638, more and more sensational pamphlets emphasized the horrors of the 30 Years' War. A theme began to develop that England should take warning from Germany, repent, and turn to piety, lest hellfire fall on the British Isles as divine punishment. Meanwhile, Charles was coping with the Scottish crisis, and Con's increasing influence had accentuated a series of royal party strategies that was conducive to Catholicism. The personal rule of Charles I was ended after a crisis developed in Scotland resulting from the king's attempt to impose a new prayer book, content of which was similar to that of the Church of England. The Scots claimed the new prayer book was nothing more than a popish mass. Organizations of protest and resistance from nobles and clergy peaked in February 1638 when the National Covenant was founded. Issuing declarations and explanations, the early and vigorous propaganda campaigns were directed in part to rally English supports. In their publications, the National Covenant depicted the dispute as a holy plight in the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. This helped persuade a growing segment of the English public to believe the royal policies in place were a conspiracy that aimed to conquer and re-Catholicize. Con saw this as an opportunity. The Puritans of England and the Episcopalians of Scotland would force Charles into dependence on a Catholic party which could be reinforced by foreign aid and blessing from Rome. The concessions for which Con had hoped were not granted, but Charles was willing to turn to his Catholic subjects for help. By doing so, he strengthened the position of his enemies, who would ultimately topple the monarchy. Despite the absence of any supporting information, the king was persuaded that French intrigue was an element in the Scottish turmoil. Charles took this view from an early point and persisted in that belief. Meanwhile, anti-Catholic sentiment in Scotland went virtually unchecked. Both more powerful and more rabidly anti-Catholic than the official Church of England, the Kirk was willing and able to excommunicate peers of the realm, banish lairds, confiscate estates, and cause a mass immigration even of aristocratic Catholics. Insofar as any Catholic peers was influential outside a regional and familial circle, it was because of court contacts. The Earl of Abercorn, head of the junior branch of the Hamilton clan, was a relative of the Queen's agent at Rome, Sir William Hamilton. Abercorn had lost touch with Scotland during long absences abroad and was deeply in debt. The Settons of Winton, who were a courtier family, had great wealth but little influence in the countryside. The landed power of the Douglas family was not great and had few political adherents. The Semples of the western lowlands had a traditional association with Spain and the Jesuit order. Only the Maxwells of Nithsdale, with many Catholic dependents and by possessing the fortress of Carvelock, had a firm territorial base. That the Covenanters branded the new prayer book as popish surprised no one except the king. Court Catholicism had aroused Scottish resentment early in the 1630s. The king's Scottish coronation in 1633 coincided with measures for church reorganization that were labeled popish. Protests against these ecclesiastical changes led to a treason case against Lord Balmerino, who opposed Charles's royal prerogative of imposing a peril upon churchmen. Balmerino's condemnation fueled suspicions in Scotland about the Laudian regime. As early as 1637, Charles had been advised of the fears from Scotland that he would change their religion. From general allegations against the prayer book, the Covenanters moved to specific accusations that it had been composed in part by Catholics. The Covenanters even questioned whether Con had brought the prayer book with him from Rome. Con, meanwhile, regarded the Covenanting movement as an anti-Catholic crusade. Even as far as venturing to suggest specific tactics, Con tried to shape the king's attitude to the Troubles, and from autumn 1637 tried to influence the king's policy toward Scotland. The fear of his influence from Con's opponents was heightened by Charles's refusal to discuss the Scottish crisis in the Privy Council before July 1638. Con put the situation into an international context, implying that Rome might provide assistance if he were to reward Catholic loyalty by relieving Catholic restrictions domestically. France, Con reminded Charles, could attack the unprotected southern coast should England become engaged in the north. But the Pope's authority could restrain Catholic powers and might even provide military assistance against the Scots. Con proposed to the king military and political use of Catholic groups in the Scottish crisis. By June 1638, he reported to Rome that the king seemed ready to rearm the Catholics who had been forbidden to bear arms since the reign of Elizabeth I. During the next 12 months, Con and the Court Catholic Party were involved in several plans to provide Catholic military or financial aid. Catholics from Scotland, Ireland, and England contributed to projects launched with royal support by summer of 1638. This was before Charles had consulted his own Privy Council and before he had planned for a general English military expedition. Thus, at the moment when the English people first became aware of the seriousness in Scotland, it drew a picture that the king was forming a Catholic party to oppose the Scottish Protestants. During his first trip north in the summer of 1638, the Marquis of Hamilton was sent to negotiate with the Scots on the king's behalf. Presumably on the king's instructions, Hamilton warned the Covenanters that if they did not accept the king's offers, they would be threatened with an Irish army on the west, and by all the power the three Marquises of Scotland and the Popish party can make with the help of the north of England. Hamilton warned the Covenanters the readiness of a Spanish army in West Flanders to be employed where the king would direct. Plans to use Catholic forces from Ireland, Scotland, England, and Spanish Flanders were being raised by Con and the Court Catholic Party during the last half of 1638. Related efforts to raise funds for the king from the English Catholics and from the Pope are worth closer examination as the projects were investigated by the Long Parliament. Con nurtured the friendship with the Catholic nobles exiled in London. With the papal agent, Douglas and Nitzdale were constantly planning military strategy during the autumn of 1638. At Con's urging, the king decided to send both Douglas and Nitzdale back to the north to rally their followers. Wentworth heard of the project, approved it, and in November they left for Scotland. An unexpected force also volunteered for the king. Married to Buckingham's widow, Randall, 2nd Earl of Antrim, chief of the fervently Catholic MacDonald clan, was to take an army of his Ulster clansmen across to Scotland. It was a plan based on Antrim's self-interest, intended to expel the Campbell clan from disputed lands in Kentire, but the proposal had obvious religious overtones. The crusading Catholics of Antrim and the Covenanter convictions of Argyll, who led the Campbell clan. The boldness of Antrim apparently startled Con because he at first hesitated to respond, though Antrim claimed he could raise 10,000 men for the cause. Hamilton, however, was convinced, used the project to threaten the Scots, and pressed it upon Charles. Not only Hamilton, but Archbishop Laud had pressed on the king to give Antrim his blessing. Antrim's promise that his invasion would cost the king nothing surely assisted in gaining royal approval. Wentworth, though Chief Deputy of Ireland, was resistant, sending a series of letters to Charles in late 1638 reminding the king of Antrim's relations. He was the grandson of Hugh O'Neill, great Earl of Tyrone, who had raised rebellions in Ireland throughout the 1590s. Antrim also had family employed by Spain as mercenaries and probably intended to call those relatives from Flanders for the campaign. Further, Wentworth warned the king that arms provided to Antrim might be used against the Dublin government if the contagion of rebellion spread from Scotland to Ireland. Charles, however, overruled Wentworth and ordered his deputy to arm Antrim's men and to provide any required assistance. Referred to as Popish, the king's English and Welsh forces in the First Bishop's War that marched north with the king, and also the force carried by Hamilton's ships to the Firth of Forth. The general of these forces in 1639 was the Earl of Arendelle, who was the target of Puritan suspicions. In June 1638, Charles formed a cabal consisting of Arendelle, Coddington, Winbank, Coke, Northumberland, and Vane to handle the Scottish crisis. The three crypto-Catholics, Arendelle, Coddington, and Winbank, immediately took an aggressive military stance toward the Covenanters. whereas the other three, Coke, Vane, and Northumberland, supported settlement. The military approach prevailed with Charles, and he appointed Arendelle as general. Con welcomed this selection. Charles hoped Arendelle's rank as a member of the ancient nobility would summon support from the aristocracy. Arendelle's uncle, Lord William Howard of Naworth, a substantial landowner and a Catholic, was not only permitted but instructed to arm for the defense of the border. Arendelle's influence on policy seemed to be increasing as soon as Hamilton and Vane had been won over to an aggressive policy. Con shared the military stance and encouraged the employment of Catholics within that force. As Arendelle's role in policy-making seemed to expand and his friendship with Con became closer, Arendelle used Con's coach to attend meetings with Charles at court, a coach that was emblazoned with papal arms. The Scottish officer Bailey described him as a known papist and the head of the Spanish and Popish factions in England. Propaganda from the Covenanters alleged the king follows the advice and counsel of professed papists and entrusts them with the chiefest offices of the arms now preparing. Even Con described Arendelle as a powerful crypto-Catholic, urging the Earl that he should use his generalship to wipe out and beat down all enemies of Catholicism and to work for the conversion of the king and the revival of the Church. If Arendelle did not see himself as the logical head of an English Catholic party, both Catholics and Puritans did. Charles created his army by means of two very different sources: trained militia from the counties and the aristocracy with their attendants. Though the peerage was proportionally more Catholic than the general population, about 1/3 of the peers were Catholic, summoning the peers would prove to be an erroneous maneuver on the king's part. Coalescing a political body that had not met since the dissolution of Parliament in 1629, the restless and disaffected had an opportunity to gather with those that were to this point merely aggrieved by royal policy. The Popish army seems to not have been from the preponderance of Catholics, but from influence of suspicious parties and people in the force. There were priests in the camp to serve the many declared Catholics. Con had discreetly made sure of their presence, and for others who did not wish to die Protestant. In addition to Catholic forces in the First Bishops' War, Con hosted the collection of contribution for the king's needs, specifically from English Catholics. Two groups were involved: the secular priests and certain Catholic lay courtiers. Anthony Champney, dean of the secular clergy, sent letters to his priests and their penitents asking them to pray for the success of the king's policies and to offer an efficacious and real expression of their loyalty. Seculars hoped to gain tacit approval from the king, and Charles welcomed this plan. Con got written permission from Rome to act as general organizer, with the aim being to utilize the only national network of Catholic communications, the missionary priests, to organize the collection. Henrietta Maria's own letter, dated 17th of April, promised protection to the collectors and reminded of her interventions on behalf of English Catholics, a subtle suggestion that generosity in turn would be appropriate. After Charles left London north for Scotland, the Queen ordered a weekly fast among the Catholics of her household for his success and encouraged the Church faithful throughout England to join. Though it was never put into operation from mid-1638 until the outbreak of the Civil War, a plan using foreign Catholic mercenaries subsidized by a papal loan was pursued with various modifications. Spain was the obvious ally to this or similar plan. Entering the crucial period of its struggle to maintain control of Flanders, Spain was also warding off the French and regaining a foothold on the Rhine. Dutch victories at sea in 1638 threatened both the treasure routes from the Indies and the supply route of men and money to Flanders. The offer of troops for Charles was conditional. In exchange, the Spanish expected close protection for their troop convoys passing through the English Channel. Colonel George Gage had been a mercenary in the service of Spain in Flanders since the 1620s. Gage suggested to Winbank that the king borrow an army of 10,000 men from Flanders under his own command, being maintained by contributions from Catholics and by a papal subsidy. In exchange, Charles would offer the Brussels government a levy of double that number for service in Flanders, and would therefore give the Pope some hope of abrogating the severe laws against recusants, if not of an absolute toleration of Catholic religion. An obvious hurdle to this plan, that the recusant laws could not be changed without Parliament's consent, was replied by taking the suggestion from the Spanish ambassador, that the army be used to intimidate Parliament after subduing the Scots. So might the king, having a foreign army afoot, subdue the Scots therewith, and at the same instant keep the Parliament in awe, that his majesty might easily make them come to what conditions he pleased, and by this means confirm his royal prerogatives and repeal such laws against recusants. The instructions that George Gage took with him to Flanders in mid-February 1639 were abundantly detailed to suggest that Charles was serious about this negotiation. Just as Hamilton had threatened the Covenanters in July 1638, there are indications that the force would be put under Hamilton's navy to surprise Edinburgh. However, negotiations were delayed by the habitually slow communications from the centralized Habsburg military planning. Though London and Brussels seemed keen on it, the plan was eventually halted. Charles was already agreed on the Antrim proposal by the beginning of 1639, was negotiating for foreign mercenaries, and willing to consider papal subsidy. The Queen had influenced army appointments for the First Bishops' War, and had pressed for agreements to her favorite, the Earl of Antrim. Henrietta Maria had so completely lent her name and support to the Catholic contribution that it became known as the Queen's contribution. The Queen had made the Scottish crisis her own, and was pushing Charles towards policy that had little benefits, but instead provided fuel for the King's enemies. George Walker, a rector of St. John's in London, preached sermons against royal policy in 1638. A criminal case was presented against him, and the Star Chamber prosecutor explained it was a dangerous sermon, when the people of another kingdom are in a tumultuous disobedience against their sovereign. George Walker's sermon compared the royal family with the story of Genesis 3:17.